They seemed like the perfect family, but behind their smiles, something dark and terrifying lurked. What happens when a stranger enters their world? You won't believe the shocking truth that lies beneath the surface. Stay with me until the end, and prepare to be disturbed by a story you'll never forget. They looked perfect, the kind of family you envy. Their house pristine. The yard always neat. Mom always smiling. Dad, a quiet presence. 2 kids, cheerful, polite. It was the ideal life. The neighbors would comment, "They've got it all together." Everything seemed flawless. But something felt off. A tension, hidden just beneath. One evening, the air felt thick. A coldness, subtle, creeping in. The kids were unusually quiet. Not the usual laughter or play. The father, distant. The mother, tense. I decided to visit. I had to see for myself. The door creaked open. A chill rushed through me. The lights flickered above. "Come in," the mother said, her voice cold. Something was wrong. The atmosphere was heavy. The house felt like a tomb. No warmth, no life. Just silence and shadows. I noticed the pictures on the walls. They weren't recent. Old photos, faded edges. The children looked younger. But their eyes, empty. The father appeared, his face pale, drawn. "Everything okay?" I asked. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, everything's fine," he said. But his voice wavered. His hands, trembling. The kids sat in the corner, their faces expressionless. I turned away, feeling an unease. I asked to use the bathroom. It was down the hall, dark. I noticed the door at the end. It was locked. A strange, guttural noise came from behind it. I froze. The sound was unmistakable. A low, scraping sound, like something being dragged. I hesitated. Then the door opened, and everything changed. The door creaked open slowly. I didn't move. I could feel my heart racing. The room beyond was dimly lit. The air was thick, rancid. I took a step forward, and then I saw it. A cage. In the center of the room. Small metal bars. Inside, a figure. A person. The figure was hunched, curled up. It was almost impossible to tell. Their face was hidden in shadows. But I could see the eyes. Wide, terrified. I stepped back, but the floor creaked. The sound echoed. The figure's head snapped up. Eyes locked onto mine. I froze. "Who is that?" I managed to whisper. The mother appeared in the doorway. Her expression was cold. No sign of shock, no surprise. "You shouldn't have seen this," she said, her voice flat. The father was behind her now. He didn't look at me. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. "We kept her here for her own good," the mother said. I couldn't understand. "She's not." The father cut me off. "She was a problem." A coldness in his tone. "We had to protect the family." Protect the family from what? I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I looked back at the cage. The figure was rocking gently now. The scraping noise again. A sound I could never forget. "Why?" I asked, my voice shaking. The mother smiled. "The perfect family isn't what it seems." Her smile stretched unnaturally wide. The mother stepped forward. Her eyes gleamed, but not with warmth. "You see, we had to make sacrifices," she said. The words echoed in my head. Sacrifices? The father remained silent. His eyes dark, distant. The children still hadn't moved. They sat there like statues. Their eyes blank, vacant. The figure in the cage shifted. A groan escaped her lips. Her face came into the light. My stomach churned. It was her. The woman was once beautiful. But now, she was something else. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. Her hair, matted and wild. Her body, unnaturally thin. I couldn't tear my eyes away. "Who is she?" I whispered, but the words felt hollow. The mother's gaze softened for a moment. She was a part of our family, but she became dangerous. The father finally spoke. Her mind, it wasn't right anymore. He paused, his hands trembling. We had to keep her. For our own protection. My breath caught in my throat. The scraping noise came again, louder this time. The figure in the cage was moving violently. Her hands gripped the bars. Her eyes, wide with fear and something darker. The mother turned to me. You shouldn't have seen this. But now you know. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The air in the room felt suffocating. My body screamed to run, but my feet stayed rooted to the floor. The children finally spoke, their voices cold and hollow. They're protecting us, they said in unison. I shuddered. We're a family, the mother said. But sometimes families have secrets. The words lingered in the air. A cold, unsettling weight. I felt the walls closing in. The shadows in the room stretched longer. The children's voices echoed in my mind. The mother moved toward the cage, her eyes never leaving mine. She unlocked the door. With a soft click, the figure inside didn't move. Her eyes remained locked on me. The father finally spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. We gave her everything, but it wasn't enough. I didn't understand. I couldn't comprehend. The figure in the cage stirred. A low, strangled sob. Her hands reached for the door, but her movements were jerky, unnatural, like she had no control. Why keep her like this? I managed to ask, though my voice trembled. The mother glanced back at me. Her face was unreadable. She couldn't be free. Not after what she did. I looked at the children, still sitting motionless. Their eyes were lifeless. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. I had to get out. The father stepped closer. Leave now, he said softly. Forget what you've seen. But I couldn't forget. The image of her face was burned into my mind. The scraping noise started again. This time, it was louder, more frantic. I backed away, slowly. I could feel my pulse in my throat. The tension was unbearable. The figure in the cage let out a guttural scream, a sound that sliced through the silence. And that's when I saw it. The mark on her neck. It was a symbol, familiar, yet strange. A mark of something ancient, something evil. My blood ran cold. Get out, the mother hissed. The door slammed shut behind me. I stumbled backward, gasping for air. I had to leave. I couldn't stay another second. But I knew. I couldn't forget what I had seen. I stumbled through the hallway, my breath shallow and panicked. The air was thick, suffocating. The house felt alive, watching me. I reached the front door, but it was locked. My hands shook as I fumbled for the handle. I turned. The family stood there, watching me. The father, his eyes hollow. The mother, her lips curled into a chilling smile. The children, unblinking, like they were waiting for something. The scraping noise behind me was relentless now. Closer. A sound of desperation, of something fighting to escape. I could feel my heart in my throat, but the door wouldn't open. I turned back to them, panic rising in my chest. Let me out, I cried. The mother stepped closer, her steps too slow. Her voice was cold, calm. You can't leave now. I tried again. The door rattled under my frantic hands, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear the figure in the cage thrashing, screaming. Her cries filled the house. The children's eyes followed me, empty, like they weren't human. The mother's expression softened. It's too late, she said, her voice almost kind. You saw too much. The father moved toward me, his pace slow, deliberate. No one leaves, he said. His voice was like ice. I took a step back, my mind racing. The scraping stopped. And then silence. The house felt too still. Without warning, the lights flickered again. I could hear the sound of breathing, labored and ragged. I looked to the cage. The figure inside was gone. My breath caught in my chest. I didn't dare look back, but I felt it. Something behind me moving. I spun around, my pulse pounding. Nothing. Then the voice came. A low, guttural whisper. Help me. It was her. The woman from the cage. Her voice cracked with agony. It was right behind me. I froze. The air was thick with fear. The shadows seemed to close in tighter. And that's when I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The whisper grew louder, more frantic. Help me. The voice clawed at my skin, sending chills down my spine. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was too close. I could feel it, a presence, hovering right behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, threatening to burst. Get away from me. I finally shouted, spinning around. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the empty, cold air. And the sound of my own panicked breath. I backed up, step by step. The walls seemed to stretch, grow darker. The house felt like it was closing in on me. I was suffocating. I had to escape. I reached for the door again, my hands trembling uncontrollably. But it was still locked. The panic surged, rising like a wave, crashing over me. I pounded my fists against it. Let me out. A soft giggle echoed behind me. It was the children. Their hollow eyes were locked on me. A sound so wrong, so disturbing. I turned, but they weren't moving. They were still, their faces fixed in eerie expressions. Please, stop, I whispered. But the giggling continued. I felt something brush past my shoulder. A cold, invisible touch. A breath against my skin. I screamed, stumbling backward. The air thickened, clinging to me like a wet cloth. The mother's voice echoed through the house. Everything we did, it was to protect you. From what? I gasped. But she didn't answer. Her smile widened, twisted. The scraping noise started again. But this time, it was everywhere. It came from the walls, the floors, the ceiling. It was all around me. I turned, frantic. I had to find a way out, but I couldn't see anymore. The darkness was swallowing everything whole. The laughter, the whispers, they were all around me. The figure from the cage. It was close. The last thing I heard was the screeching of metal. Then nothing. The silence was suffocating. I couldn't hear my own breath. Everything had gone still, unnervingly still. I stood frozen in the pitch-black room. My heart thudded in my ears, loud and frantic. The cold air clung to my skin, the darkness pressing against me like a weight. And then, the floor beneath me shifted. I felt a tremor, deep in the ground. A low rumble, like the house itself was moving. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was tight, constricted. The walls felt like they were closing in. I felt something brush against my leg. I couldn't move, couldn't react. The sensation was strange, a cold, thin touch, like something brushing past me. The scraping came again, louder, closer. I turned. The figure, her face was right there. She was in the shadows, but her eyes gleamed, wide and unblinking. Her breath was heavy, labored. I could hear her muttering, a low, incoherent sound. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, like she wasn't alive. Her fingers, long, thin, and cracked, reached toward me. I could feel the air shift, cold and suffocating as she moved closer. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I was trapped. Her voice, a whisper, almost a growl. Let me out. I wanted to scream again, but the words caught in my throat. I could feel her hands near me, her fingers brushing against my skin. Her touch was like ice. And then, a voice, distant but clear. The mother's voice. We're all part of this. The family, the secret. It never ends. I glanced back at the door, but the shadows were consuming it. There was no escape. The scraping grew louder, frantic. The figure was pulling herself toward me, her eyes fixed on mine, frozen in terror and something darker. I could feel the pressure building, the weight of the house, its dark secrets crushing down on me. And then, the room went completely silent. The silence was unbearable, a deep, unnatural stillness. I couldn't hear anything, not even my own heartbeat. I was suffocating, the weight of the darkness pressing down on me. I reached out blindly, but my hand met only the cold air. And then, the floor trembled again. This time, more violently. The walls shook as if the house itself were alive, shifting, groaning under some unseen force. I turned, panic rising in my chest. The figure, she was still there. But now, something had changed. Her face was twisted in agony, her mouth wide open as if to scream. But no sound came. I stumbled backward. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the air thick and stifling. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Then I saw it. The cage. The one the figure had once been trapped in. It was no longer empty. The shadows seemed to pulse. The darkness alive and moving. I could see figures, shapes, emerging from the walls. There were more of them, more like her, more lost souls, trapped within the house. They all turned to face me. Their eyes were hollow, vacant, but there was something behind them, something hungry. I felt a chill run through my veins. They were coming closer, slowly, but they were coming. I reached for the door again, but it was no use. It was sealed shut, like it had never been there at all. I was trapped in a house that wasn't just a house. It was a prison of the past. The figure in the shadows, the one from the cage, moved toward me, her fingers outstretched, her eyes pleading. "Help me," she whispered. But there was no humanity left in her voice. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen by fear. And then, as the darkness closed in around me, I realized the truth. I wasn't just a visitor. I was part of the family now. The realization hit me like a cold, sharp blade. I wasn't just trapped in the house. I was a part of it, a part of whatever twisted, horrifying thing this family had become. The figure in the shadows reached for me, her fingers brushing my arm with a coldness that sent a jolt of terror through me. Her eyes, wide and pleading, no longer held any semblance of humanity. She was nothing more than a ghost, a lost soul trying to escape. But there was no escape, not for any of us, not for her, and not for me. I could feel the presence of the others, the ones that had emerged from the walls. Their hollow eyes locked on me, their movements slow, deliberate. I couldn't look away. I couldn't breathe. The scraping sound was back, louder now, filling the room with its gnawing, relentless noise. It was coming from everywhere, like the walls themselves were alive. The house, no. This place. It was more than just a building. It was a prison, a feeding ground for something ancient, something that had consumed everything in its path. The mother's voice echoed in my ears. "You thought you were different. You thought you could leave. But you're just like us now." I tried to run again, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, locked in place by the terror that gripped my heart. The shadows closed in around me. The figures were too close now, their hands reaching, their eyes hungry. The door was gone, and so was any hope of escape. I was swallowed by the darkness, my screams lost in the suffocating silence. And then, just like that, it was over. The house was silent once again, and the family, the perfect family, was whole. The silence lingered, thick and suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't feel. My mind was numb, disconnected from everything. The house seemed to breathe around me. The air was heavy, each inhale a struggle. I tried to open my eyes, but it felt like they were weighed down by some invisible force. The family was there. I could feel their presence around me, like shadows hovering just out of reach. The mother's voice, soft and distant, echoed in my mind. "Welcome home." It was a whisper, but it cut through me. I wanted to scream, to fight, to break free. But there was no fight left in me. I could see their faces. The mother, the father, the children. They were standing together, smiling that perfect, cold smile. But their eyes were empty. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. Their gaze held me, locked in place. "We've been waiting for you," the father said, his voice low. "We're a family. Forever." I could feel it now. The truth. I was part of them. The family wasn't just the four of them. It was a cycle, a dark, twisted thing that never ended. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. The figures in the shadows reached for me, their hands cold and unyielding. I couldn't move, couldn't escape. They were all here, the lost souls, the ones trapped in the house, the ones who had tried to escape, only to become part of it. And now, I was one of them. The family was whole again. Perfect. Trapped in a never-ending nightmare. And so I stood with them. Silent. Empty. A part of their secret. A part of their twisted love. Forever. The air around me grew colder still. I could feel the weight of the house pressing in on me. The walls almost suffocating in their tightness. The shadows whispered. Faint murmurs that echoed in my mind. I could still hear their voices. The mother's voice soft, almost tender. "You were meant to join us." The father's voice, distant but firm. "We were all meant to be together." The children, their faces expressionless, didn't speak. But their eyes were full of something dark, something that made my skin crawl. I looked around, but the house had changed. The once familiar walls now felt alien, the rooms twisting in on themselves. The hallways stretched longer, farther than they had before. I reached for the door, my hand trembling, but it wasn't there anymore. The house had consumed it. There was no way out. I turned, my eyes darting across the room, desperate to find any sign of escape. But everything was the same. The shadows, the silence. The family, watching me, the figure from the cage, the one I had seen before, emerged from the darkness once more. Her eyes, wide and frantic, locked onto mine. "Help me," she whispered again, but there was no pleading in her voice, only emptiness. She reached for me, her cold fingers brushing my arm, and that's when I understood. She wasn't begging for freedom. She wasn't asking for help. She was showing me what I had become. I looked down at my own hands. They were pale, almost translucent. I could feel the cold creeping through my veins. I was no longer myself. I had joined the family. I had become a part of the house. The house wasn't just a prison. It was a cycle, a trap that consumed everything in its path, until nothing was left but shadows. And now, I was one of them. The family was complete, and it would stay this way forever. The darkness surrounded me, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I was never leaving. The darkness pressed in around me, a suffocating embrace that closed off every possibility of escape. I could feel the house, its cold walls, its hollow spaces, consuming every bit of my being. I stood there, motionless, staring into the faces of the family. They were watching me, their empty eyes full of that same chilling smile. They had waited for me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my voice was gone. My body, heavy with the weight of the house, refused to move. I looked at the figure once more. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken and filled with despair. She was the first, the one who had failed to escape, the one who had become a part of the house. And now she was just like them. I reached out to her, but there was no warmth in her touch. Her hand was as cold as the walls, frozen in the same never-ending cycle. She wasn't reaching for help anymore. She was part of the family, just as I was becoming. A faint whisper brushed my ear. The same words, the same chilling message. We're all part of it now. The house had claimed me. I could feel it creeping into my mind, slowly erasing who I had been. I was losing myself, bit by bit, until there was nothing left but darkness. The shadows grew thicker, wrapping around me like a shroud. I could no longer tell where I ended and the house began. Time lost all meaning. Days and nights blurred together. The family remained in place, watching, waiting. They were as frozen as I had become, locked in a cycle that had no end. I tried to speak, but my voice was no longer mine. I couldn't remember the sound of it. The house had stolen it, just like it had stolen everything else. I was no longer a visitor, no longer an outsider. I had become part of the family. And so, we stood together, silent, trapped, forever. The house had swallowed me whole. I could feel it pulsing, its dark energy flowing through the walls like blood in veins. I was no longer just trapped within it. I had become part of it. The family stood unmoving, their eyes fixed on some distant point, as if they were waiting for something. But what? What were we all waiting for? I looked at the figure again, the one from the cage. Her eyes had lost all trace of life. She was just a hollow shell, like the rest of us. The house had taken her, and now it had taken me. We were all bound to it, lost in its endless cycle. I wanted to scream again, but I knew it would do no good. The house wouldn't let me. I couldn't even move. Time no longer passed in the same way. It was as if the house had frozen everything, suspended in a moment of pure darkness. The family, the house, even I, we were all frozen in place. But then something changed. I felt a shift in the air, a crack in the stillness. It was subtle at first, like a breath held too long, but it grew louder, more pronounced. The family turned their heads, slowly, in perfect unison. They looked at me, their eyes empty and dark, as if they had been waiting for this moment. The air around me felt colder, thicker, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper. I could hear a faint whisper, like a distant voice calling my name. "Come closer," the voice murmured. It was not the mother's, or the father's, or even the children's. It was something else, something darker, older. I felt an urge to obey, an overwhelming need to move toward the sound, to go deeper into the house, to follow the voice. But I hesitated. Something inside me still clung to the remnants of who I had been. I didn't want to become them. I didn't want to lose myself completely. But the shadows were growing closer, pressing against me. The house was pulling me in, and I knew there was no way out. The family's eyes watched me, unblinking. Their smiles grew wider. And the voice came again, stronger now. "Come closer. You're one of us now." I could feel the darkness wrapping around me, like hands tightening around my chest. And in that moment, I knew I had already lost. The darkness closed in tighter, its grip suffocating. I could feel it pulling at me, dragging me into its depths, into its eternal void. The house was alive, its presence overwhelming. It was no longer just a place. It was part of me, and I was part of it. The family's eyes remained locked on mine, their hollow gazes unwavering. Their smiles never wavered. A perfect, empty mask. The voice whispered again, so close now I could almost feel it on my skin. "Don't resist." It was impossible to fight it. The weight of the house, the force of its power, was too much. I felt my body move of its own accord, my feet taking steps I couldn't control. The shadows stretched before me, A dark path leading deeper into the house. I followed it, unwilling and yet unable to stop. I glanced back at the family, but they were no longer just standing there. They were moving too, slowly, unhurried, as if time didn't matter to them anymore. The figure from the cage was beside me now, her pale hand reaching out, as if to guide me deeper. Her face was empty, like all the others. She was just another part of the house, just like me. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, and the weight of it was crushing me. The shadows were everywhere now, surrounding me, wrapping themselves around my body. I could feel them pulling me further, further into the heart of the house. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I could hear the house calling to me, its voice like 1,000 hushed murmurs, beckoning me to join them, to become one with it. And then it happened. A door opened ahead of me, a door I hadn't seen before, a door that led into the deepest part of the house. I felt the pull. I couldn't stop myself. I was being drawn toward it. Closer, closer. The family was there too, silent, waiting. They were already inside. I stepped forward, my feet moving without my will. The door closed behind me, and, in that moment, I was swallowed whole. The darkness enveloped me completely. There was no light, no sound, just the suffocating grip of the void. I couldn't tell where I was anymore. The house had consumed me, and now there was only the nothingness. I was alone, but not really. I could feel them, the family. They were still there, somewhere in the endless dark. Their presence lingered, always watching. Time seemed to stretch on forever. I couldn't measure it. The seconds, the minutes, they were irrelevant here. I didn't know how long I had been standing in the pitch-black room. But then, I felt something shift. A faint crack in the stillness. A whisper. "Welcome home." The voice was soft, soothing. But it was not the mother's. It wasn't anyone I recognized. But it felt familiar. I turned slowly, my mind clouded by a haze I couldn't shake. The shadows began to stir, forming shapes, figures that emerged from the dark like phantoms. And there, in the center of the darkness, was a figure. A new one. It was me. But it wasn't. I stood there, frozen, staring at the reflection of myself. But it wasn't a reflection. It was something else. Something more. The figure smiled at me. A cold, knowing smile. And then it spoke. "You were always meant to be here." The words echoed in my mind. I tried to speak, to scream, but no sound came. The figure reached toward me, its eyes empty, yet full of something. Something dark. Something ancient. And then, it touched me. I felt the coldness of its fingers seep into my skin, traveling through my body like ice. I tried to pull away, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The house. It had already taken me. I had become one with it. And now, there was no turning back. The figure's smile widened, and I understood. I had become part of the family. I had become part of the house. Forever. The coldness of the figure's touch spread through me like a poison, chilling every inch of my skin, locking me in place. I could feel the house pulsing around me, its walls alive, its dark heart beating in rhythm with mine. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body was no longer mine. I was frozen, rooted to the spot. And the house knew it. The figure withdrew its hand slowly, its eyes never leaving mine. And then it spoke again, its voice a low, haunting whisper. "You belong to us now." The words echoed in my mind, repeating, insistent. They felt like chains, binding me to this place, to the family, to the house. I turned my head slowly, forcing my eyes to glance around. The shadows were moving again, shifting, forming shapes that were not quite human. The family was there, standing silently in the darkness, their eyes fixed on me. They were waiting. They were always waiting. The house was alive. It had claimed me, just as it had claimed all the others. And now, it would never let me go. I tried to remember who I had been, what my life was like before this. But the memories were slipping away, fading like smoke. The house was erasing everything. The figure, my reflection, stepped closer. It was no longer just a mirror of me. It was something else, something more. "You're one of us," it repeated, its voice dripping with an eerie satisfaction. The shadows around me grew thicker, closer. I could feel them pressing in on me, like hands, like the walls closing in. I could feel the cold, but I couldn't feel myself anymore. I couldn't tell where I ended and the darkness began. I had become a part of it. I had become a part of the family. And as the shadows closed in, I knew I was lost. There was no escape now. I was home. The house had become a prison, a labyrinth of shadows and cold whispers. And I was its newest resident. The family stood in the dark corners, watching with their vacant eyes, their smiles frozen, unmoving, but somehow I could still feel them. They were all around me. I couldn't escape. The house had woven its darkness into me, and I was part of its twisted, suffocating embrace. The figure that had once been me, my reflection, stepped forward, its movements unnaturally smooth, as if it belonged here. It reached out to touch my face. Its fingers were cold, far colder than the house itself. It felt like ice, like it was draining all warmth from my skin. "You were never meant to leave," the figure whispered. Its voice was my own, but it wasn't mine. It was the voice of the house. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I was mute, frozen in place. The walls shifted around me. The shadows grew, stretching, pushing in on me from all sides. The family's presence surrounded me, their cold gazes never leaving. It was like I was being pulled into the very core of the house. Its darkness, its emptiness. The floor beneath me seemed to vanish, and I was falling into an abyss, into a void of endless night. And then I hit the ground, but there was no pain. There was no relief. Just the stillness of the house, the endless, suffocating silence. I looked around. I was no longer in a room. I was in a new place, a place I couldn't recognize, but it felt familiar. The family was there, but not in the way I expected. They were standing beside me, their eyes not vacant, but full of something deeper, something darker. I was one of them now. The house had taken me, and the cycle would continue, forever.